Dit is donderdag die 4de April. Ons gaan aan met The Long Lost Grave. They cautiously started shuffling backwards, keeping their hands well in sight, awfully aware of the pointed rifles. Klaus suddenly lunged forward with startling swiftness and seized Kathy's arm. With a violent jerk, he spun her away from the others, and she sprawled with a loud shriek on the muddy forest ground, half dangling from his powerful grip. Rob started violently, but Ashley was ready, and he found himself staring into the muzzle of the .45 automatic only 6 inches away. At that moment, Janine fainted and sank to the ground with a soft sigh. Herbie instantly dropped to one knee beside her. Hold it, damn you!" Golden Forbes screamed with a note of panic in his voice. All around him, rifles slapped against the shoulders. Nerves suddenly tensed, stressed to breaking point as adrenaline washed through them. Tony Fisher and Louis Krause were ready to kill with fingers tightly on the triggers. Bailey started shaking, unable to keep the Uzi submachine gun still while sweat beaded nervously on his forehead. Everyone remained stock still. Rob stared into the pistol. Herbie hunched forward over the seemingly unconscious Janine, his hands near his ankles. But even in his distress and the awkward situation, he noticed the fluttering of her eyelids and the position of her body and hands. Good girl, he thought. Poised and tensed, everyone waited. One move now and all hell would break loose. Tense silence, and then, "No one move!" The voice was hard, clear and commanding, and no one moved. "This is the police." Sergeant Mike Visagi's voice boomed against his voice, left no doubt as to his serious intentions. Rob acidly smiled as Ashlyn Gordon Forbes passed the pistol, and he saw the sickening expression of shock and disbelief coming over his face. "Yes," Rob spoke softly but clearly for all to hear. "The police was in this all along, and I have a government contract for the recovery of the gold." Ashley blanched visibly. Well, his mind wailed. Where had he gone wrong? What now? He couldn't possibly give this up. And, what is more, there are many others on their way here. "You don't have a chance, Gordon Forbes. I have the contract." He stopped abruptly and glanced with alarm past Ashley. There was movement at the edge. "But that contract won't help you," came the voice of Lieutenant Murray from the darkness. "Hold it, Sergeant," he snapped as Visagi wheeled around and found him face to face with his superior and Dan Johnson. Murray's Walter P.38 service pistol was aimed at him. For brief seconds, he stared. "You!" and Mike Visagi lunged forward. A single shot rang out from the woods, the heavy bullet tearing into the lieutenant's back and erupted in a spray of blood from his chest, and Visagi collided with the lifeless body. At the same instant, Bailey's nerves snapped. With a frightful yelp, he squeezed the trigger of the submachine gun, and all hell broke loose. It was the break Herbie and Janine had been waiting for. In a blur of movement, his right hand lashed out from his ankle, and the two-edged dagger flew straight into and through Ashley's extended wrist. The steel crunched through the bone, and the hand flared open uselessly. Rob caught the automatic deftly in his sideways dive. Janine drew her concealed pistol smooth and fast, even as Herbie moved for his. Her first shot hit Bailey in the chest. The second snapped his head back. She never fired a third. The combined automatic fire from Tony Fisher and Louis Krause hit Herbie across the chest, chewing into, through, and beyond him. The same violent hail of bullets slammed into Janine's petite body, throwing her back. She never felt Herbie crumbled and collapsed awkwardly on top of her. Rob landed with a dull thud and rolled over onto his knee, firing. The heavy Colt forcefully kicked in his outstretched right hand, firmly supported by the left, and the heavy bullet struck the whining Gordon Forbes in the center of his chest, lifting, straightening him upwards. And the second hit an inch to the right of the first. Rob swung the pistol and saw Louis Krause's head distort and explode under the impact of the .45 round even before Gordon Forbes was fully down. And suddenly, it was all over. A stunned silence fell over the scene, the forest still ringing and echoing with a mad staccato of the shooting. Dazed and confused, Rob stared over the bloody scene, noticing the irregular, scattered bodies with a sense of incredulity. Tony Fisher was flung forward over the crates of gold. Mesmerized, Rob watched the blood and slowly spilled over the glinting metal. Death. Vaguely, he became aware of movement. Sergeant Visagi, muddied and bloodied, clutching his arm, struggled to his feet. Constable Lepre stood stupefied, the R1 rifle in his hands, still aimed at Tony Fisher. Then he slowly turned his head towards his companion. But Gousaard too was beyond help. There was blood everywhere. Herbie! Rob's head whipped around and he froze in horror. He stared and the pistol dropped from his hand. A deep groan escaped his lips as he stumbled and half fell towards the limp remains of his brother Herbie, who had saved his life. Oh gosh, no, why them? And a raw, undefined and agonizing pain raked his body as he lifted the lolling head onto his lap. All through the tears that rolled down his cheeks, he saw the pale, petite face of Janine, her short hair in disarray. He leaned across, touching the soft cheek, but no sound came over his consorted lips, only the tears that rushed down his cheeks uncontrollably. Then he remembered Cathy, his heart cramped with fear and concern. Bewildered, anxiously, he glanced around and saw nothing. Cathy! He yelled and pushed himself to his feet. Cathy! But the only answer that came back to him was the raging wind in the treetops. He frantically stumbled to where he had last seen her with Klaus, but nothing. Oh gosh, please, not her! He cried out loud and swung back to Visagi. At that moment he saw Will Stein and Selena Naudé standing appalled at the edge of the clearing. Will was still clutching a rifle. With a wild roar, Rob started forward, but Mike Visagi forcefully grabbed his elbow. Wait, Rob! His voice was harsh with urgency. Calm down. Control yourself. They helped us. If it wasn't for them, we'd be dead too. And Rob slowly subsided until he stood trembling next to the policeman. Cathy, he muttered. Cathy and Klaus, where are they? But Visagi could only shake his head. He too had lost track of them. Then Selena spoke up and her voice was trembling. I think I saw movement over there. She pointed to the far side. Rob scooped up one of the torches and ran across the clearing. For moments he searched the ground and grunted. Here are tracks, he called back, and there was a renewed vigor and strength in his voice. I am going after them. You take care here." Nothing more needed to be said, and Rob dashed off along the dull footpath at a brisk pace. In his heart was only one thought: Cathy. Mike Visagie slowly went between the fallen, but there was nothing he could do for anyone. They were all dead, and he had to steel himself against the threatening nausea, forcing his mind to other things, and to think. He vaguely heard Selina crying against Will's chest, and he turned to them. "You must be Will Stein," he said quietly. "You are the lifesaver who received a medal for bravery a couple of years back. How come you got mixed up in this?" Will shrugged dismally. "The sea and diving. I didn't expect this kind of thing to happen. We didn't know about the old man either, only learned the truth of it all today. We were told to stay aboard, but we followed, hoping to be of help. I wanted to warn you about the lieutenant hiding out there, but you were too far away and moved in too quickly. You did well enough, and you certainly were a great help. I contacted the police from the boat, and they told me that you were on your way. There was nothing more we could do." Will paused, breathing deep. "This is a mess, so many dead, and that out of greediness." Sergeant Visagie stood watching them thoughtfully. Even in his pain and unease, he could see the fear in them, the uncertainty, and that they couldn't possibly have known about this plan, and that decided it for him. "I checked up on both of you, and as far as the records are concerned, there is nothing against you, but this certainly doesn't look good. 2 dead policemen as well. However, I'm quite willing to forget that you were here at all." He saw the surprise and hope on their faces. "Take the cruiser. It isn't on any of our records." "It's registered in Colombia," Will replied softly. "Excellent. Just take the boat and get the hell out of here. Be gone before morning." "Why are you doing this?" Selina asked. "I don't know. Maybe because you got caught up unknowingly and unintentionally. Maybe because you saved some of us tonight. Me for certain, as well as the Priya. You deserve a chance, but I advise another country." Will and Selina glanced at each other. They could hardly believe their ears. "Thank you, Sergeant. We will never forget." Will replied humbly, and Selina nodded in agreement. "Get the hell out of here," the policeman growled and turned away. "We need help," he told the Priya. "Go to the vehicle and summon assistance. Contact Peter Crawford and be quick." Only when they had gone did he slump to the wet forest floor, exhausted and weary, and was violently sick. It would be some time before help would arrive. All around him the rain and wind were continuing. It was cold. Lord, he thought dismally, what a night. The moment when the blubbering Baileys started shooting and the heavy bullet burst through Murray's chest, Klaus Weber knew it was all over. He didn't stick around. Cathy screamed as he grabbed her arm, but it was drowned by the stunning violence of the guns and shouts. He brutally dragged her after him, and she tore at him with hands and nails. But he continued. Within moments they were in the forest and out of sight. Cathy sensed the danger and flew at him instead of resisting. Klaus tripped and stumbled. Her hands clawed at him, her nails raking his face, aiming for his eyes. But he was a strong man, and he recovered quickly. Seizing her by the hair, he jerked her away and slapped her viciously. Once, twice, until she half collapsed, half dangled in his hand. Then, still holding her like that, he started running. Her nose was bleeding, her skin burning from his blows, and there was a terrible pain in her head and scalp as he roughly and remorselessly hauled her after him. With her mind dizzy with pain and fear, she ran stumbling after him into the dark night. Klaus didn't know where he was going, nor could he care. He only wanted to get away. But even in his blind, headlong flight, he knew there was danger. He knew they would follow, or at least they would try. Of that he was certain. He plunged through the wet undergrowth, instinctively following a footpath that led almost straight into the forest. Once or twice he nearly collided with a tree or crashed in the dense undergrowth. But without slackening his brutal grip on Cathy's hair, he would struggle back to the dim path and continue his flight. He didn't know how long they went on like that. He was vaguely aware that the shooting had stopped, and besides the wind and rain and their rasping breaths, there was nothing. They could never find him now, he thought. There was no way how anyone could know where he was, nor how anyone could follow them. And, who knows, perhaps there was no one left to follow. He remembered the glistening gold, now lost, and the mere thought intensified his anger in a fury that dulled and clouded his senses. He stopped abruptly. He swore at Cathy. "It is your fault," he rasped, and at that moment Cathy realized that Klaus Weber had gone mad. With a wild scream, he gripped the front of her shirt and tore it away. Cathy screamed and recoiled, kicking out. Her boot foot sank into his groin. He gasped and lost his grip. It was all she needed. With the speed of an adder, she slipped past his groping hands and dashed along the footpath, the wrong direction. But all that mattered was to get away from him, to reach safety. Behind her, Klaus swore viciously as he slipped on the muddy ground, stumbled and fell. Ahead of her, a shallow mountain stream loomed. Cathy entered it at full speed, tripped and fell heavily in the rushing stream, gasping and choking in the cold water as she awkwardly scrambled on all fours. From the corner of her eye she saw Klaus coming, and she frantically tried to get away, to evade his groping hands. But she was an instant too slow, and his hands gripped the back of her shirt. With a sharp, ripping sound it tore as she broke from his grip, and with a frightful sob she floundered away through the knee-deep water. Klaus roared furiously and leaped after her. She vainly tried to scramble out of the stream, but slipped and slithered back into the water, right into his powerful hands. She screamed, clawed, and kicked, but Klaus had completely lost all feeling. He hit her. Once, twice, and a third time he drove his balled fist into her face, bloodied her nose and lips, and she went mercifully limp in his grip. Klaus hardly noticed or cared. Grunting like a pig, he dragged her out of the stream into a clearing and dropped her half-unconscious body to the ground. Grinning insanely, his breath panting, he sank on his haunches beside her. Seeing the milky whiteness of her belly, the thrust of her breast under the muddy bra, he was assaulted by a mad lust to defile her, to humiliate her beyond reason, and before he would strangle the life out of her. So smooth, his hand stroked her naked body. His fingers danced over her navel. She had never allowed him to touch her. Too good for him. But Rob de Boer did it to her. He knew it. He could see it. De Boer, that bastard. With a growl, he snapped her bra away, allowing her breasts to fall free. Trembling with anticipation, he undid her belt and zipper and forced her trousers down. The semi-conscious Kathy whimpered with pain and tried to fight him off, but she was too weak, and he raped her. Rob de Boer stuck like a bloodhound to the dim footpath. Every once in a while he would pause briefly to make sure that he was still on the right track. He never slackened, forcing himself onward at the greatest speed possible. He knew that Kathy was somewhere ahead and that she was in grave danger. He had now no conception of time. Oblivious of his own weariness, he continued along the muddy path. The water sloshed in his sodden boots, his clothes drenched and muddied, but not once did he falter. And all the while his conscience was crying out with guilt, sorrow and pain. Herbie and Janine were dead, and Kathy gone, and his heart was heavy with fear and anxiety for his woman. He lost the track twice, where the footpath was too unclear to follow. Both times he lost precious minutes in locating the tracks again. But fortunately the forest soil was muddy, leaving clear prints and marks where Weber had fled with Kathy. He saw the shallow stream almost too late, checked his pace just in time, but nonetheless continued without stopping, straight through this and scrambled up the steep opposite bank. The footpath stretched ahead. Rob did not waste time and went on. Minutes later he stopped breathlessly, paused, hands on the knees, recuperating for a moment before he flickered the switch. He anxiously played the beam around, but nothing. Alarmed, he advanced a few paces. Still nothing. Oh Lord, no, he thought. Please, let me find them. Don't let any harm come to her. For a brief instant he stood thoughtfully, roughly retracing his route in his mind. The stream! Yes, that is it! And wiping his nose with a wet shirt sleeve, he spun around and started back. He ran as fast as he could in the dark forest. A branch lashed at his face, stripping the skin from his cheekbone. Pain shot through his face, but he hardly noticed. Rob crashed into the stream, losing the torch in the process. Numb and discouraged, he lay panting in the cold water, and he was suddenly overcome with despair and weariness. Forgive me, Kathy, he whispered. I can't. And in his mind's eye, he again saw her standing beside the dirty Datsun on the muddy forestry road, her dishevelled hair around her angry face. With a groan, Rob rolled over and pushed himself into a sitting position, forcing himself to think, to act, to save the woman he loved and adored. He sniffed and spat sideways into the stream. Now, he thought with a sudden clear mind. Which way? Then he heard it, and stilled. He sat very still, listening, trying to determine direction. He slowly stumbled to his feet and cautiously waded downstream. The horrifying sounds grew louder and more distinct, and then he heard a soft whimper of pain. Rob's heart went cold. He took another few uncertain steps, listening with each step. At that moment, there was a hoarse, triumphant cry. Rob de Boer stepped into the clearing, stopped and stared, shocked at the scene of the rape. He saw Klaus Weber as he was backing away from the limp, whimpering girl, still unaware of Rob's presence. You bastard! Klaus whipped around and stared at Rob in shock. Then slowly he began to laugh. Rob went berserk. The kick was just a blur of movement, smooth and straight into Klaus's groin. The rapist doubled over and Rob slammed his knee into the pain-confronted face, throwing him backwards. Klaus groaned in pain, desperately fumbling in his pocket as he backed away warily. With a snarl, Klaus located the drew the snub-nosed revolver, But Rob was not waiting. In one fluent, savage move, he was under the revolver arm, one hand clutching the wrists, his other gripping the front of Klaus's shirt. Rob spun around. In one powerful heave, he sent the bigger man flying over his back. Klaus crushed on the ground, lay stunned for a moment and realized with a sickening feeling that he had lost the gun. He saw the boa closing in, saw the murderous look on his face, and Klaus reacted instinctively. He rolled to attack and kicked Rob's legs. The latter lost his footing and went down, and Klaus Weber was up in an instant. His booted foot lashed out and slammed into Rob, dropping him again. Klaus roared insanely, and in the little light, his face was contorted with hate and fury. His bear-like hands groped for Rob's neck and throat, clamped close. Even in his craziness, he knew he didn't stand a chance if he allowed the boa room to move and put every ounce of strength in his hands. Rob realized he was in trouble, but the thought didn't bother him. All he wanted to do was to destroy this monster, and for once and for all. He wanted to kill Klaus Weber. But Klaus's confidence was returning as he exercised his great strength, oblivious and undisturbed by Rob's feverish struggling. "I will kill you," he snarled. "I will kill you with the same ease I killed the old man. And I will rape your woman again." The words went home. Think, his mind screamed, and Rob stopped his futile struggling. Above him, Klaus growled victoriously as he felt the surrender. And at that moment, Rob gave him a vicious jab with the elbow. Again and again. His elbow exploded into Klaus's ribs, and at the same time he turned in the grip, and his next punch was like the impact of a bullet. Hand extended with pointed fingers, he drove it with every inch of power and skill into the pit of Klaus's stomach. The big man gasped painfully and doubled over. Rob's twisted free and doubled over. Rob twisted free, stumbling away, panting and gasping for breath. But there was no time to lose. His left fist collided against the side of Klaus's head, and his right smashed the lips. Klaus stumbled dizzily. Rob hit him again and again, punching the repulsive face to a bleeding pulp. And after each savage blow, the big man seemed more and more dazed and confused. He'd tried to block, to counterattack, but Rob was unstoppable. In his mind were the bullet-riddled bodies of Herbie and Janine, the limp figure of Kathy and Jos Visagi. He was mad with anger, intoxicated with the lust to kill and destroy. It became an escape valve for his guilt and grief. "You bastard! You bastard!" he screamed with blind rage as he launched fist after fist into the bigger man's face and body. Rob hardly aimed his blows, just threw them with fervent hatred. "Bastard! Murderer!" Klaus tottered on unsteady legs, his hands awkwardly trying to cover as his dazed mind refused to function properly. But not once did the brutal attack falter. There was no one to put a stop to it. He was meticulously being battered and broken into the ground. With blood streaming from his battered face, Klaus wailed as Rob's fist once again broke through his defenseless hands. And then Rob paused, watching and swaying Weber, who was pathetically trying to stay on his feet. Rob swung his right fist, every last bit of energy he could muster behind it. It struck Klaus Weber on the chin, and he fell over backwards. Then there was silence. The combat noises, The slapping fists and painful exclamations were gone. Only the wind and rain and Rob's panting remained. Bloodied and numb, his chest heaving, Rob stood over his fallen enemy. Still besieged by the killing rage, he glowered at the prostrate figure. But it did not move, and he sank on his haunches and felt for a pulse. There was none. Again he tried, felt at the side of the neck, nothing. Then he noticed the angle of the head and neck. Klaus Weber was dead. That last terrific blow had broken his neck. Rob pushed himself wearily to his feet, wiped ineffectively at his face and stumbled across the clearing to where Cathy lay, unmoving in the dripping rain. She was naked, lying on her side and curled into a fetal position. Her milky skin glistened pale and wet in the rain, her hair matted with dirt and mud. He knelt beside her, overcome with sorrow and grief. He carefully and tenderly turned her towards him, lifting her lolling head on his lap. He saw the blood and purple bruises on her face, the scratches on her breasts and pale stomach. She was cold in his arms, and beyond her he saw the ragged remains of her clothes, the torn pieces of her panties trampled into the mud. And he remembered her naked body above him in the flickering firelight deep in the cave. The pair of black panties covering the sinister sneering skull of Captain Martens and the terrible premonition he had had. He started to cry. Hoarse, sorrowful sobs tore from deep inside him, burst uncontrollably over his lips, and tears streamed from his eyes, mingled with the blood on his face and dripped on Cathy's pale white skin. He wept, overcome by his sorrow and regret, for no one was spared. "Oh Lord," he thought between his mournful sobs, "Herbie and Janine are gone, so many dead, and Cathy." He shook his head, staring through the teary haze at her quiet and injured face. The gold. It had all started there, and his obsession to find it. It was a cursed effort from the beginning, just as the gold always was, violence and death and misery. "Oh," he cried aloud. "Why them? Why not me? Who is responsible?" But the forest was quiet and without answers. Rob remained unmoving in the falling rain for a long time, cradling Cathy's head tenderly in his hopeless sorrow. But reality slowly returned. It was cold and wet, and Cathy needed warmth and care. He had to start back. He covered her body as best he could with his khaki shirt and bush jacket and stooped down to lift her up. At that moment he heard movement in the forest. A branch snapped with a sharp crack, and he heard a faint sound. It sounded like feet moving through the undergrowth, like a stampeding herd of cattle. Startled, he glanced up, staring in alarm. The moon broke through the fast-drifting cloud bank for a brief moment and shone with startling brightness through the opening above the clearing. The forest abruptly seemed to burst open, and the huge beast stepped into the clearing. Rob gasped involuntarily and stared in wonder. There, in the clearing, in the bright moonlight and less than 20 paces away, stood a magnificent elephant bull. It was the biggest and most magnificent elephant he had ever laid eyes on. The huge body towered immensely, shining with wetness, its large leaf-like ears forward. The great ivory tusks was the best part of 5 feet. The terrific elephant stood there a moment longer, and then it was gone. Rob vaguely saw a cow passing behind him, then a calf and another cow. Then they were all gone, as quickly and mystically as they had appeared. Rob swallowed. He had just witnessed the famous Naisna elephants, and ironically, that was why he had come to the forest in the first place, to find these elusive beasts. But he had found so much more. With Cathy tightly in his arms, he started back along the footpath. Warden Opperman and Peter Crawford found Rob and Cathy. Armed with a stretcher and warm blankets, they quickly evacuated her to a waiting ambulance. Meanwhile, the police had finished their preliminary investigation and the bodies had been taken away. The 3 treasure crates were gone in the security vans of Volkskas Bank, and by mid-morning, the weird scene of disaster was desolated. Last to leave were the warden, Rob, and Peter Crawford. Rob had wanted to leave with Cathy, but the police needed his statements to fill in where Sergeant Visagi was unable to do so, especially on the matter of Klaus Weber's death. So he had stayed and helped where he could until the end. Exhausted as he was, he fell into a troubled slumber as soon as Peter drove the Land Rover away, or rather the Land Cruiser. He was too tired and weary to protest when Anne unceremoniously hustled him into bed. He slept right through the day and night and well into the following day. Therefore, it wasn't until visiting hours that evening that he went to see Cathy in hospital. Via Anne's own anxious inquiries, he had learned earlier that she was out of danger and, although conscious, still very weak and confused. Clutching a small bunch of flowers, he arrived at Cathy's ward. Rob hardly noticed the presence of the large number of visitors. He was only anxious to see Cathy. He was stopped at the entrance. "Excuse me, sir," the nurse said politely. "Are you perhaps Mr. Dubois?" "Yes." "Is this the room of Mrs. Moore?" She nodded, but made no move to clear the doorway. "Mrs. Moore asked me to give you a message, sir." Rob frowned slightly. She said she's sorry, but she doesn't want to see you." He gaped at her. "What do you mean she doesn't want to see me?" "She wants you to leave without seeing her. I'm sorry, sir, but that is what she wants." "Get out of my way," he said briskly and swept the astonished nurse aside. "Sir, you mustn't," she shouted, but he was past her and into the room. She shrugged helplessly and desperately glanced up and down the corridor for security. Rob stopped beside the next hospital bed, filled with tenderness and concern for the woman who lay pale and motionless against the pillows. The lovely hair was fanned out on the white pillowcase and her eyes closed, and he stared at her. Purple bruises colored her face, and there were stitches in the swollen upper lip, and he wanted to cry with guilt. "Cathy," he muttered thickly. "Cathy, it's me." At the sound of his voice, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him sadly, and he saw the shame and humiliation in those teary, grey-blue eyes. Then she turned her head away. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, almost inaudible. "Please, Rob, please leave." "Cathy," he began lamely. "Cathy, Please go, Rob, don't come back." Behind him, the door opened noiselessly and a doctor, followed by 2 security guards, entered. "Come, sir," he ordered sternly. "You better leave. You are upsetting her." Dazed, and with her words echoing like an accusation in his mind, he allowed them to lead him from the room. He distantly heard the doctor say that there could come a time when she would need him, that her reaction was quite normal, and he didn't listen any further. How far he had walked towards the exit he didn't know, but he noticed an elderly couple coming from the opposite direction. The woman was strangely familiar. He stopped them. "Give this to Cathy," he muttered and pushed the bunch of flowers into her hands. "Tell her I love her." And without another word he turned and walked away, engrossed in his own grief and sorrow. Cathy's parents stared after the young man. Her mother smiled bleakly. "That must be Robert," she said. Chapter 13. 6 months later, in the Western Cape. It was winter and the afternoon breeze came chilly from the snow-covered mountains in the northeast. The descending sun seemed to have little effect on the low temperature and proved a far greater nuances in the eyes of the motorist than a comfort against the cold. Cathy Moore squinted her eyes behind the dark glasses. The brilliant orange sun, low above the western horizon, was directly ahead and in her eyes as she drove along the Cape Peninsula coastal road in a northwestern direction. But she was unconcerned and at ease. This stretch of road was fairly deserted during the time of day, and she knew it well. She had been using it twice a day for the past 2.5 months. Ever since she had started working at the Cape Point Nature Reserve. At the small seaside village of Scarborough, she geared down to reduce speed and turned to a short stretch of dirt road. Minutes later, she stopped at the little Toyota Corolla behind her parents' holiday cottage, where she had been living in seclusion since the dreadful experience 8 months before. Cathy briefly paused on the steps, fumbling for a key, and shivered slightly. It was cold and the sun had disappeared behind the watery horizon, leaving the western sky in a magnificent display of few scattered orange-lined clouds. Cathy sighed contentedly. Here she was at peace with herself, slowly overcoming the winds in her mind. The cottage wasn't large but comfortable and with a magnificent view of the Atlantic Ocean. Although it lacked many modern facilities and luxuries, it provided her with everything she needed, especially peace and quiet. She smiled faintly as she pushed the door open. On Wednesdays, her mother came from Muizenberg to clean and dust. Despite Cathy's mild protest on the ground that she could do it herself, her mother kept coming every week, and every time Cathy found her fridge and cupboard stuffed with fresh food and other necessities. There was also a small bundle of post deposited on her dressing table. This always received her attention first. Tonight was no different. Cathy lifted the stack of envelopes with trembling fingers and undid the string. She flipped the top letter away, and there, as usual, obviously as arranged by her mother, was the letter. And every week her heart beat uncontrollably as she stared at the address on the white envelope, written in a firm hand. It never failed. Every week the letter was there, from Rob de Boer, but she never read it. She stared at it for several minutes, assaulted by her memories, and her heart ached with longing. Then she steeled herself and opened the top drawer where she kept all his letters. Piled neatly on top of each other, unopened and unread but strangely comforting, was 8 months' faithful correspondence. She momentarily hesitated with the envelope in her hand. It felt different, larger and stiffer, and she dearly wanted to open it, but she knew that her defenses would crumble if she did. But why not just this once? Goed, dit is dan dit vir vanaand. Môre aand se laaste episode van The Long Lost Grave gaan 'n bietjie korter wees. Dankie vir jou belangstelling en jou ondersteuning. Geniet die aand verder.